Cyprian Ivanov. Given that analogies play a huge role in thinking about a complex situation, what analogies did LRH and DM use to describe things? I know that LRH borrowed a lot of stories from military lore, such as wanting to visit the stockade to see men who could fight not look pretty on the parade ground. The moral implications of military service, when speed and decisiveness are sometimes lifesavers, are different than those of a non-lethal environment, but do Sea Org members think about the difference in moral issues? Okay, Cyprian, thank you for this question. And no, Sea Org members do not really make wide, broad, nuanced distinctions when it comes to moral issues. It's Hubbard's way or the highway, and that's pretty much how the Sea Org thinks about things. It's a very march in lockstep, do what Hubbard says. It's Hubbard's way or the highway. That is the attitude of the Sea Org. And if you're a good Sea Org member, then it's a virtue to think that way. It's virtuous. It's a good thing that you are marching in lockstep. It's a bad thing. It's immoral. It's out ethics for you to disagree with the group, to disagree with L. Ron Hubbard, to disagree with what's going on. So they don't really think about things at that level. They're not deep thinkers because they are indoctrinated out of being deep thinkers. You don't want deep thinking going on in a group like the Sea Org. You want compliance. You want conformity. Okay. As far as analogies go, though, Hubbard did often use military analogies in his lectures. He also talked often about his time as a writer, pulp fiction writer, even as a writer, as an educator, because he would sometimes go and do lectures and talks about writing, and he talked about that. So he would use analogies out of his wartime. He would use analogies out of his writing career, mostly, and from his flying time. He would use analogies with flying because he really prided himself on his barnstorming years. And of course, he would use seafaring analogies because Hubbard was a sailor, and that was legit. He really did know how to sail, and he really did know how to captain boats. And so he would use analogies all the time from ocean seafaring stories and stuff like that. Miscavige is interesting because he tends to draw his analogies more from, well, they're written for him for the most part. But when he presents, whether they're his or whether they're written for him by Dan Sherman or somebody else, he will tend to go for pop culture analogies more so. He relates to current events. He wants to try to stay relevant and current and look like he knows what he's talking about in terms of current events. So he will use comparisons and examples and analogy from current events. And he will try to use clever analogies. And let me give you a very specific example, was when the Golden Age of Tech was released in 1996. Hubbard, we talk here on this show, or I've done videos about evals and analysis and stuff like that. Well, when the Golden Age of Tech, when Miscavige in 1996 decided to basically rewrite how Scientology training would be done, he sold it with an analogy. And the analogy was that the blind had been leading the blind. That was the phrasing that he used to explain why it was that Scientology training was in the toilet and why it was so badly done and why it needed to have a whole overhaul, is because the blind had been leading the blind. And everybody, oh yeah, that makes so much sense, right? And so Miscavige got away with basically completely overhauling Scientology training and slowing it down to a snail's crawl. I mean, he made it so much worse. But that was the analogy. That was the example that he used, right? The phrasing. So anyway, that was one that came to mind right away. So I thought that might be interesting in answering the question. But that's how I remember them talking about things and drawing similes and comparisons. So there you go.